Welcome to CSP 340, Chapter 10, Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at the definition of developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities. We looked at 3 types of intellectual disabilities. And now we're going to look at characteristics of intellectual disabilities. We look first at cognitive characteristics. People with intellectual disabilities have problems with concept development. This is a matter of being able to put things in categories and being able to compare things to one another. Because of this, when we teach kids with cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities, what we want to do is we want to go from concrete to abstract. So we always start with things that are very obvious that you can see, feel, hear, touch, and then we move to the things that you have to think about. Kids with intellectual disabilities have problems with memory. Kids with LD, if you remember from the earlier chapter, have problems with short-term memory and long-term memory. But kids with intellectual disabilities tend to have fairly normal long-term memory. What they have trouble with is short-term memory, specifically with working memory. The average person can maintain 7 things on their mind at once, and we clump things together. So, for instance, with telephone numbers, we clump 3 digits, 4 digits, and Social Security numbers, we do 3, 2, 3, and that's how we remember things that are longer than that 7 chunk. For people with intellectual disabilities, they can only remember 3 or 4 things, and so it makes it more difficult for them to do complicated tasks because they can't maintain all of the things they need to in their head to manipulate the information. People with intellectual disabilities also have problems with metacognition, knowing about knowing, learning about learning. And so they don't understand how their own learning takes place. And so they approach learning tasks somewhat randomly. They don't learn well incidentally. They don't learn well by watching other people. So as a result of that, we have to explicitly teach them anything that's procedural, that has steps. They have problems with social judgment. Some of this has to do with their concept development, that they don't notice the things that they need to notice, and then if they do notice those things, they don't put them in categories that when someone does this, then this is a bad thing. They have a problem with pro-social skills, things like how to introduce yourself to someone, how to ask for help, how to take criticism. These are all skills that you learn by watching other people. Because they don't watch other people, they don't learn these skills incidentally. One more time, we have to teach them explicitly. Then they have problems with immaturity. They act like they're younger. Behaviorally, they have problems with impulse control. And what we mean by this is that they just act without thinking. If it occurs to them that they can do something, then they'll just go ahead and do it. A lot of this has to do with a poor sense of cause and effect. Problems with aggression, except some people with intellectual disabilities actually have problems with passivity. This tends to be more true of people with intellectual disabilities in the lower end, where they do not initiate interaction with other people. Academically, they have overall poor academics. When we talked about learning disabilities, we said that they might have a strength in reading comprehension and a weakness in listening. They might have a strength in math calculation and a weakness in math reasoning. What we find for kids with intellectual disabilities is all of their functioning is going to be significantly below average. Yes, they do have individual differences. Typically, they do better in math than they do in reading, but still their math scores and their reading scores are both significantly below average. And then last, they have problems with language deficits. They have a smaller vocabulary than other children of their same age. They use more simple sentences than other children their same age, and they just simply produce less language than other children their same age. So now we're going to look at classroom instruction and adaptations. Your book makes 7 suggestions. They say first, to increase the sense of belonging. Now this is in an inclusive classroom. What happens for a kid with intellectual disabilities is when he enters that classroom, he knows he's different. He knows that the other children are doing things he can't do. He knows the other kids are picking up on things quicker than he is. So he needs to be connected. You need to deliberately connect him to other children in the classroom, deliberately connect him to the activities of the classroom. Keep in mind what he's interested in, what he's good at, and capitalize on those things. The second thing is using routines to ensure safety. Now, what we mean by that, this goes back to the idea of poor judgment. Kids with intellectual disabilities don't think about cause and effect. And so therefore, anything that you need to make sure that this child's where he needs to be, doing what he needs to be, then you need to have a set routine that he's going to follow. Accepting varied learning goals is another thing that a teacher has to do. So, for instance, if the other children are having to write an essay, then this child might need to write a series of questions or a series of statements. If the other kids are doing a research project where they're going online and they're collecting things and then synthesizing that into a project similar to what I've got here, the child with the intellectual disability is not going to be able to work at that level of complexity, but is there a small piece of that he can do? That leads us to cooperative learning. So if we have kids working in groups, and you have him in a group where there are children of various ability levels, then you can scaffold where they're all working on different tasks that are commensurate with their ability. Providing hands-on instruction. Remember what I said about being concrete versus abstract? Wherever possible, the kid with intellectual disabilities needs to be able to touch it, to move it around, to see it. And then building self-determination, and you do this by building in choices. So are there two different ways he can give you this information? Are there two different projects he can be working on? Let him make choices, even if the choice is as simple as whether he's going to type it or write it by hand, or when he's typing, which font he can use. Now we're going to watch a brief video about person-centered planning.
What is person-centered planning? Kind of a loaded question, I understand.
Person-centered planning grew out of a passionate concern to support people with developmental disabilities in discovering and contributing their gifts. Something that's been really misunderstood, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years. People have kind of tried to turn it into something that comes out of school, so it's like an IEP for an adult, so it happens every year, so it's kind of manualized and ritualized and often embedded in the agency practices rather than being about the person. So some of the work that I think we've been doing is kind of healing people up from those experiences. And for lots of people, person-centered planning was an alternative, and we still talk about this, it was an alternative to kind of institutional plan. People who didn't work in institutions and have always worked in the community have had the experience of planning with people where you're only able to offer them 3 options because that's all you've got, right? And so that's not person-centered planning. So institutional planning is where there's often a big stack of papers, people can't read them, and so you've got all the power, and they're kind of sitting at that end of the room, and there's like 9 professionals around them telling them what to do. And you start off with this list, here's all the things that went wrong last year, and you've worked on these things so that you're now down to 40% behaviors or 50% behaviors or something like that. Person-centered planning is often seen as merely not institutional planning, and I think that has done it a real disservice, right?
I think what we do when we're doing person-centered planning is, even in the guise of the agency, we're asking people to resist doing that, to do that. Let's get the check boxes. Let's satisfy all of the people who are, all of the bodies that are asking us in our service provision. We ask people to resist all of that, shift all the focus off of that to the person. It's not the job of the person to figure out what you do for me, satisfy those bodies.
That's the fulcrum point, just the discovery and contribution of gifts.
So if you define your gift as something that helps you to connect with at least one other person in a meaningful way, it helps people to relax about, I'm not a pianist, I'm not, and for the people around them as well, to start to look in a different way at who that person is and what their they're here to do, what they're on this earth to do. If we walk away and a person is maybe even just connected with that idea and connected with some of the things that they do in a gifted way, then I feel like the process has been a worthwhile one. We have the luxury of process, that can look different for every person, depending on who they are, who their network is, what's happening, sort of where they are along the spectrum of things as well.
I think a lot of the processes really work for folks who are in that position, right? So, because we're not going in to tell them anything, we're going in to listen to them. And so, Shelley in particular really holds some space, and so then they can kind of lean into that space in whatever way they want. The other thing, I'm hesitant about the idea of self-determination these days, because I think that the focus could be more on interdependence. I'm not sure that independence has taken us where we really wanted to go, and that a lot of people have ended up quite isolated and alone, right? If we look at the kinds of lessons that people with disabilities teach us in these planning sessions, there's these different factors. You can see that there's an invitation, so the isolation's reduced. There's graphics, so you got different modalities for communication. There's a space for people to speak into rather than to be kind of told.
One of my goals in PAP, off and on, in any conversation, is to ask some questions to sort of bring people to a space where they understand that they have the same values. Often our values will be around making contribution, having choice. It all sort of comes down to what love is in the room, right? As people start to realize, oh, this isn't about, the picture I had in my mind. This is really about this person's human drive and human want to make a contribution or to have more people in their lives or whatever it is. So it can be about the values. It can help people to connect and then sort of get that energy to move forward with whatever the dream is.
So the other thing that was in your chapter was the idea of alternate assessment. So traditional assessment is fill in the blank and multiple choice and efficient and objective. Alternate assessment allows the person to plug into their real life that's meaningful, it's higher level, complex knowledge. So things like essays, portfolios, open-ended problem solving, performance simulation, all of these are alternative assessment. So that is chapter 10.